I've got to talk about Astral Throne. Astral Throne is advertised as a roguelike version of Fire Emblem. Does it do that successfully? Is it a fun game? Well, as it turns out, the answers to those two questions are actually different. Yes, it is a fun game, but not because it's roguelike Fire Emblem. In fact, the likeness of this game to the game Rogue is so broadly defined and loosely fulfilled that I can't really call it a roguelike. No, instead, I would say that Astral Throne is closer to Loop Hero, which is a game that itself is advertised as a roguelike despite not meeting those qualifications. Let me explain. The roguelike genre is strictly defined as having qualities like the game Rogue. But we're not living in the 20th century anymore. Here in the modern day, we have a much more loosely defined definition for a roguelike. Nowadays, a roguelike must have two things. 1. Permadeath, and 2. Procedural generation. So, using these two features as the cornerstones for what makes a roguelike game, let's see if Astral Throne measures up. Well, if you lose your main character or fail a mission in the allotted time, you lose and your run ends. Ta-da! Permadeath. Check. Now, Fire Emblem already works like that, but let's see past that point for right now. As for procedural generation, well, it does that in some ways, but not the ways most players will be looking for. You see, Astral Throne has a ton of procedurally generated elements for characters, their stats, their classes, their abilities, and pretty much everything having to do with the gameplay, with the exception of maps. Here's the problem, though. The campaign is more or less the same every time. Let's compare the challenges you face in Astral Throne to the challenges you face in Slay the Spire as an example. In Slay the Spire, depending on how you look at it, there are anywhere between 8 and 13 unique normal battle challenges you could possibly face in Act 1. And on average, you're expected to face around 5 to 10 normal battles in an act. In other words, the types of challenges you face from one run to the next can have quite a great level of variety. In Astral Throne, there are the exact same 10 encounters spread weirdly throughout a map. Additionally, you are penalized for facing 4 or more battles before facing the boss of an act. As a result, being forced into the same first battle in an act may have its design advantages, such as programming an onboarding experience just into the one map, but it means that you feel like you're wasting your opportunities to see the other encounters by starting the first fight there each and every time. To add to this, there are only 3 acts, and the third act is abbreviated and functions as the finale. I do really appreciate the challenge getting dialed up extremely quickly leading into some of the later fights, but I also wish there was more variety to the types of battles you could come across. To add to this, every boss fight of an act is always the same map and same boss, regardless of the characters in your party. Speaking of characters in your party, let's talk about that. The main characters in your party interact with each other depending on in-lore relationships. There are quite a few combinations of conversations leading to a lot of unique dialogue. The problem is that the story is fairly run-of-the-mill. To the team's credit, I definitely wasn't expecting the story in a roguelike Fire Emblem to be stellar in the first place. However, and I really do mean this as a large however, I wanted to make sure I got all the negative attributes of Astral Throne out of the way right from the beginning because the game does a lot very well. I will be the first to say that my favorite part of Fire Emblem is in raising the characters and weighing the pros and cons of nurturing risky but potentially powerful characters or nurturing safe but consistently good characters. The feeling you get when you successfully grow a character that turns into an absolute powerhouse is just incredible. On that topic, let's talk about how stats work. Every stat has an individual experience gained each time that character gains experience for any reason, but some of the stats have stat growths beyond 0%, which means that that particular stat gains much more percentage experience gain compared to a stat with a growth of 0%. For example, if your character has a strength growth of plus 100% and a defense growth of plus 0%, that means that each time this character gains 100 experience in each of their stats, their strength gets 200 experience and their defense gets 100 experience. This makes it so that every character will eventually get a bonus of 1 to that stat, but it may take a while. The keen-eyed of you may notice that means that no stat growths are random. They're entirely character and player driven. So then, does it fail in giving off the emotion of nurturing a strong character? Absolutely not. In fact, this may be Astral Throne's strongest attribute. If you play a Fire Emblem game, a specific character will always start the game with the same stat growths, barring a few player decisions, such as class selection and in-story decisions. But every single character in Astral Throne is procedurally generated, including class, stat growths, abilities, and even names. Obviously, these recruitable characters don't have many lines that they say in the story, but that's okay. These randomly generated characters mean that you can have a favorite gameplay character that's completely unique to your copy of Astral Throne. The best part of this is that those characters sometimes make reappearances in future runs, and you can even customize which already seen characters will be present in your run, and that's really cool. So no, Astral Throne isn't really a perfect representation of a roguelike Fire Emblem. Its story is okay at best, and there are a handful of technical issues which I usually solve by closing and reopening the game. It really only has one campaign, truly, but its gameplay variety is excellent. On this point, let's talk about the weapons in Astral Throne. There are 8 weapons, 6 of which form into 2 weapon triangles. Light weapons beat heavy weapons beat shield weapons, and shield weapons beat light weapons. If you just think of heavy weapons as axes, shield weapons as spears, and light weapons as swords, this triangle will make much more sense. Heavy weapons usually reduce your attack speed but deal tons of extra damage, while light weapons usually increase your attack speed but deal less damage. There's a similar triangle for magic. Familiar magic beats focus magic beats barrier magic, and barrier magic beats familiar magic. You may think that this is just laziness and recreating the weapon triangle but for magic weapons, but each weapon type has its very own niche style of thing that they accomplish. Beyond this, all physical weapons, except projectile weapons, usually have a range of 1, whereas magic weapons, except ritual, usually have a range of 1 to 2. Therefore, assuming that all other stats were equal, which the weapons don't really have equivalents in other weapon types, the magic weapons are much more greatly sought after. But somewhat realistically, physical weapons and training in physical weapons is just more common than magical weapons in their training. That means that magic is slightly more powerful while also being slightly rarer. Speaking of training, every character starts trained in at least one of the 8 weapon types, and may come across items that let them learn more weapon type disciplines. Since magic weapons and their training are both slightly more rare, that sought-after 1 to 2 range is ever so slightly tougher to come by. But when you get a character that can use a lot of magic, and also knows numerous magic weapon disciplines, you feel like a master. We haven't even talked about projectile weapons and ritual magic. These are both weapon types that usually have a range of exactly 2. Projectile weapons gain advantage against air mounts, while ritual magic have advantage against land mounts. They also have no weapon types or conditions against which they usually have disadvantage. This makes projectile weapons and ritual magic incredibly powerful, and a great addition of something for any character to learn if you have at least one item of that type. We haven't even talked about weapon skills. There are 6 raw stats that gain experience: strength, magic, defense, resistance, dexterity, and speed. Most of them work very similar to the way they work in Fire Emblem, except for dexterity. Dexterity not only determines your ability to hit accurately, but also determines whether or not your character can use their weapon skills. Most weapons come with a weapon skill, which can be used if the character wielding it has at least a certain amount of dexterity. That means that the character lacking in both strength and magic can still be incredibly useful by being able to utilize a bunch of utility spells with weapon skills. This was just the change that dexterity needed to make it just as useful as all other stats a character could have. For this reason, you never quite feel like you just ever got a stinker of a character. Every character could potentially be good at something, as long as you have the equipment, encounter, or opportunity to make it good. And that's ultimately what balance is all about. It's not necessarily that every character or stat or weapon is just as useful as all the others, but rather that everything has some use case. I really like what Astral Throne is so far, and I'm happy to say that the problems with it are content related rather than systemic. So I feel that with just a few changes, Zero Sun Games could have something really special on their hands. They've already announced a sequel, which I haven't quite taken the chance to take a look at, but I hope to be just as excited about it as the original Astral Throne. Great work to the team, thank you for making the game, and I hope everyone watching has a great day.